Hello. The episode you're about to listen to is part of a multi-part series introducing an overview of Japanese history. This is a repeat of one of the original projects the History of Japan podcast was built on, and is intended to serve as an update and supplement to these original works. After 10 years, my hope is to return to this approach and to do it a little bit better given the skills that I have improved in the intervening years. If you haven't been doing so already, you should listen to these episodes sequentially, starting with episode 501. Without any further ado, enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 534, The Imperial Democracy. Today, Japan is a functioning democracy, albeit a somewhat messy one, though, to be fair, most democracies are. And particularly in my own country, we have a habit of giving ourselves all the credit for that as a result of the American-led occupation of the country, which took place after World War II. And to be clear, for its faults, which we will get into, the occupation of Japan most definitely did help usher in Japan's modern democracy. But I also think that we Americans, in what is, to be fair, something of a time-honored tradition over here, tend to give ourselves a little bit too much credit in emphasizing the occupation. The reality is that, much as was the case with post-war Germany, part of the reason that post-war Japan's democracy succeeded was that there was a pre-war example to point to. Despite a largely anti-democratic constitution set up by a government run by powerful, unelected, and unaccountable autocrats, Imperial Japan did enjoy a brief period of democratic success, known to history as the Taisho democracy. That name comes from the Taisho emperor, who succeeded his illustrious father Meiji after the latter's death in 1912. Taisho was never a particularly involved emperor. As a child, he was a committed Francophile and largely disinterested in politics, much to his father's chagrin. As an adult, he was hampered by a series of health issues that likely included some psychological issues, though what exactly the problem was remains unclear. The Taisho democracy emerged under Taisho's rule, which lasted until the emperor's early death in 1926, and opponents of the democratic reforms actually blamed them in some cases on the presence of a weak emperor on the throne, whose weakness left openings for such challenges to the existing order. The reality, though, was that the roots of the Taisho democracy went back well before the Taisho emperor's rule, and lay instead in the foundation of the empire's politics during the Meiji period. You might remember that under the Meiji constitution, Japan did have a parliament with some limited oversight power, though only one of the two houses was elected, and that one only by the small number of men who paid enough in taxes to qualify to vote. Still, weak though this representation was, it did provide some outlet for dissent against government policy, and in particular against the monopolization of political power by the Meiji autocracy, which in turn was dominated mostly by former samurai from the old Choshu and Satsuma domains. That dissent crystallized around opposition political parties, the names of which I'm not going to bother you with here because they promptly began merging and splitting and reforming in a way familiar to anyone with a passion for parliamentary politics, which makes tracking them a big pain in the rear. The upshot of all of this is that said political parties were on occasion able to pressure the governing oligarchy, primarily using their control of the budget, which had to be approved by the elected House of Representatives, which those parties controlled, and which was constantly growing during the Meiji and Taisho periods, meaning that even the Constitution's provision which rolled over the past year's budget if a new one didn't pass, didn't do enough to disarm the parties from strong-arming the Meiji autocracy. The issue was consistent enough that one of the Meiji oligarchs, Ito Hirobumi, took it upon himself to form his own political party, the Rikken Seiyukai, or Constitutional Friends of the Government, to contest elections and try and disarm the opposition. This kind of worked, but it also came off as approval of party politics by one of the senior-most figures of the Meiji oligarchy, lending the thing some legitimacy, and in time the Seiyukai too would become somewhat oppositional to the elected oligarchy. The parties could also use their national platform, a perk after all of elected office, to try and publicly humiliate the governing oligarchy to undercut its authority. After all, the proceedings of the Diet naturally got a lot of publicity, and that publicity, if it was directed against the government, well, that's a pretty powerful weapon in the hands of a smart politician. If that's all a bit abstract, consider an example. In January of 1914, a massive scandal racked Japan's politics as it emerged that leaders within the Imperial Japanese Navy had taken huge kickbacks from the German industrial firm Siemens in exchange for guaranteeing extremely lucrative military procurement contracts for that company. The scandal actually only emerged when a disgruntled former Siemens employee named Karl Richter stole incriminating documents and then leaked them to the Reuters news agency. The resulting scandal, of course, made huge headlines, which the opposition parties took full advantage of to demand a series of hearings into the corrupt dealings. Things came to a head when the Prime Minister and former Admiral Yamamoto Gonohyoe submitted his budget for the year. At this point, prime ministers were appointed directly by the emperor, which is to say by the emperor's advisors in that unelected oligarchy, and so Prime Minister Yamamoto had no loyalty to the political parties. His budget also included a huge fleet expansion bill and big taxes to pay for it. The budget ended up completely deadlocked as his expansion plans got wrapped up in the very public debate around the so-called Siemens scandal, and in the end, Prime Minister Yamamoto had to resign to get things back under control and get the budget passed. Scandals like this were one way for the parties to grow their visibility, so to speak. The other was a good old-fashioned protest and political violence, which, despite the image some have of Japan as some sort of harmonious society, was a feature of its politics throughout the 20th century and, really as we've seen, throughout all of Japanese history. The first big modern protest movement took place in 1905 in the aftermath of the Russo-Japanese War, which you will recall from last week Japan did win, but less as a result of its own decisive successes, and more as a result of the complete train wreck that was late Tsarist Russia. Still, if you were an average Japanese citizen in 1905, that wouldn't be your impression. State propaganda heavily played up the idea that Japan was winning securely and decisively, and that everything in the war effort was going great, thank you very much for asking. Which was why when the final peace deal that emerged in 1905 came out, it was a bit of a shock to the citizens of Tokyo, who had expected, in line with all that propaganda, a peace treaty hugely favorable to Japan, and one which in particular would include a massive indemnity, a cash payment by Russia to Japan. This last bit was very important because Japan had, as most countries do, taken out big loans to pay for its war. The indemnity was, in essence, supposed to erase the cost of the war by making Russia pay for it, ensuring Japan could enjoy both the fruits of victory and avoid raising taxes in the aftermath to redress its fiscal balance. Instead, the final peace deal, negotiated with US President Teddy Roosevelt as the mediator, for which he got a Nobel Prize, included no indemnity. Japan simply hadn't won decisively enough to be able to force that kind of demand on Russia. Indeed, from a certain perspective, Japan didn't get much of anything in exchange for over 80,000 dead. Compare that, by the way, to just 17,000 against China 10 years earlier, as well as a massive expenditure of cash. Yes, Russia did agree to let Japan dominate Korea, but realistically that had already been the case. Russia ceded the southern part of Sakhalin Island to Japan, but that frigid island was of little strategic or economic value. It ceded its position in southern Manchuria to Japan, but that position was in the form of a lease from China for lands used to build and maintain what became the South Manchuria Railway. Valuable, to be sure, in terms of a strong economic position in China, but not an outright colony. So yeah, in a certain sense, Japan didn't get much from a war that had demanded a lot of sacrifices, and when that news broke, Oh my, were people pissed off. A coalition of nationalist journalists, university professors, and politicians who had previously supported the war effort began to criticize the deal when word of it reached home and called a rally in Hibiya Park just south of the Imperial Palace for September 5, 1905. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police, who unlike American cops are an arm of the national government at this point controlled by the powerful Home Ministry, banned the gathering as an illegal disturbance of the peace, but despite that, over 30,000 people showed up on the day and overran the barriers set up around the park to enter. After a 30-minute rally full of speeches condemning the treaty, the group dispersed, but that was not the end of things. Some protesters began to scuffle with the police. Others, led by the hawkish politician Kono Hironaka, marched towards the Imperial Palace to continue the protest. Still others began to attack buildings associated with the government, such as the nearby offices of the Foreign Ministry or the pro-government newspaper Kokumin Shinbun, as well as the headquarters of the state-run streetcar line. The resulting riot lasted for 3 days, from September 5th to the 7th, and was only brought under control because the government of Prime Minister Katsura Taro declared martial law, which was left in place until November. When it was all over, 15 streetcars, several buildings, and over 70% of Tokyo's koban, the small police substations scattered throughout the city, had been destroyed. Over 2,000 people were arrested, though only 104 of those went to trial, with 87 convictions. 17 people died in the riots, hundreds more were injured. The Hibiya riots, as they are known, were of course hugely disruptive to the life of Tokyo, and a signal of the unpopularity of the Portsmouth Treaty specifically. But they're also very important to the evolution of Japanese democracy because the riots were not, in the end, just about the unpopularity of the peace treaty. Many of the speeches at Hibiya Park were critical of a government which was perceived as unaccountable to its people, which had made big promises about how the war was going and what people would get in exchange for their sacrifices, and then walked those promises back with no thought. Protest rhetoric was very critical of so-called clique government, by which was meant the power of the former Satsuma and Choshu samurai, who dominated imperial politics from behind the scenes. By contrast, they demanded constitutional government, which gave more power to elected representatives in the Diet and was thus reflective of the actual will of the people. And while the Hibiya riots were not successful at either ending clique government or revising the Treaty of Portsmouth, it actually went into effect the day the riots started, so it wasn't like it could be changed, they were also not the last of their kind. Tokyo would be racked by 8 more such riots over the course of the next 13 years, though none except the very last would reach the same scale as the original. These protests would generally be triggered by one of 3 issues. The first was a report of government corruption. Indeed, the very same Siemens scandal we talked about just a moment ago saw a riot in Tokyo from February 10th to 12th, 1914. 435 people arrested, and the grounds of the National Diet itself being stormed by protesters who felt the body was too soft on corruption. The second cause was criticism of clique government and a demand for a more representative constitutional state, an idea that would usually crop up at all these protests, even if it wasn't always a focal point. The last was anything to do with tax policy or finance. Several of these riots were triggered either by news the government planned to raise taxes, which how dare it demand more from the people without giving them more in return, or that the government planned to hike the fare for the streetcar system. Seriously, there were 2 whole separate riots about streetcar fare increases. People really did not want to have to pay more to commute. So, why does all this matter? Well, for starters, in a certain paradoxical sense, it was indicative of the tremendous success of government policy. We haven't spent a huge amount of time in this overview on education and social policy during this period, but one of the main concerns of the imperial government was the creation of a genuinely national Japanese identity. Before the end of feudalism, very few people outside of the samurai class really would have seen themselves as part of a collective Japan. They would have identified more with their home village, or at most the feudal domain or province they lived in. The idea that someone living in Hakata on one end of Japan was tied by some shared political destiny to someone in Aomori on the other end was rare outside of the educated feudal elite. And so one of the big projects of the new government was to convince the people of the new Japan that they were kokumin, people of the nation, not just residents of the places where they lived, but part of a shared national community. Education and socio-policy were geared to this very end, intended to produce a sense of identification among the people of Japan with each other, with their government, and of course, most importantly, with their emperor. And by the 20th century, this did work, but as the Hibiya riots showed, maybe it worked a little too well. To quote the historian Andrew Gordon, quote, "In matters political, the people had views of their own, which they were more than willing to express in word and deed. They took various steps to appropriate public and imperial spaces. In their anger at being excluded, the crowd asserted that Hibiya Park belonged to the people, not to the state." Gordon also notes that among those arrested during the Hibiya riots, the universal sense was that the rioters were supporters of the emperor who had been angered by the wrong-headed policies of the emperor's advisors, quote, "in essence offering their condolences to the emperor for the bad policies of his officials." So yes, the state had succeeded in forging a national Japanese identity, but now the people who held that identity were using it to challenge the government's power and demand more influence over their own lives. The other reason the riots matter is that the last of these riots would formally inaugurate the so-called Taisho democracy, the 1918 Rice Riots. Now, as the name might imply, these were, in fact, riots over the price of rice, which by 1918 had started to skyrocket around the country. In part, this was just good old-fashioned supply and demand at play. Japan's population had continued to grow throughout the period from an estimated 44 million in 1900 to over 55 million by the end of 1918. Despite the heroic efforts of Japan's farmers, domestic output just couldn't keep up. Those farmers ran into the same problem which plagued Japanese agriculture since the dawn of recorded history. Even with advances in farming technology and field reclamation, the fact remained that in such a mountainous country there was only so much land that was farmable, and only so much you could get from that land. The Meiji oligarchs tried to redress the issue by gearing the colonial empire towards providing the home islands with food. What became South Korea in particular was, during the years of Japanese rule, essentially the breadbasket of the empire, but even this could not keep up with demand, and so prices rose. This was a huge issue for rice in particular. During the feudal period, most of the population hadn't actually been able to afford rice, but by the early 20th century, rice was estimated to make up somewhere around 70% of the nation's caloric intake. By comparison, during the early post-war years, it dipped to around 50%, and has been around there pretty much ever since. The price of rice was not something government officials cared to address at all. Official state policy was more concerned with avoiding rice imports at any cost because of a concern that buying rice from overseas to keep prices under control would negatively affect the nation's balance of trade. So instead, the Meiji government actually pushed a rice tariff through the Diet that put import duties on any foreign rice, though rice from the colonies was exempted, in effect deliberately keeping prices high in the name of national economic policy. And this all came to a head in the summer of 1918, as rice prices, which had been climbing, more or less doubled from the spring to the summer, at a time when blue-collar workers were on average already spending around 27% of their annual income just on rice. For white-collar workers, it was close to 18%. For comparison, in 1953, the national average was 12.9% of your budget just on rice for all of Japan, and in 1963 it was 7.4%, so that's a lot of people's daily budget going just to rice. Why is it so expensive now? Well, for one, much of Japan's transport capacity was wrapped up in shipping goods to the Allies during World War I, which, to be fair, brought a lot of money to Japan's economy, but also meant there was less capacity to move rice around the empire, which made moving rice even more expensive, and of course that gets added to the final sales price. For another, government officials were busily stockpiling huge volumes of rice for themselves, building a stockpile to support a planned and ultimately very unsuccessful attempt to intervene in the Russian Civil War against the communists. That intervention would end in failure after several years, but nobody knew that in 1918, and in preparation, the army was buying up a huge volume of rice to feed its soldiers, driving the price even further, while taking advantage of laws on national security to force the sale of said rice below its market rate, which meant farmers had to make up the price difference in their sales to civilians. So all told, not a great time if you're looking to be able to, eat. And so, one July evening in 1918, women in the fishing village of Uozu in Toyama Prefecture along the Japan Sea coast began to protest outside the offices of the local government against the shipping of rice out of the prefecture to the cities, demanding that they instead be allowed to buy the rice at subsidized prices. Press coverage of the women's protest then saw copycat movements spring up around the country, and before long, Kobe, Kyoto, Osaka, and Tokyo were paralyzed by their own mass protests against the price of rice. Those protests then transformed into riots as city dwellers in particular attacked the shops of rice dealers and burned them to the ground, as well as going after police stations and koban. In many cases, the riots were matched by strikes called by factory workers against wages which they increasingly couldn't afford to feed their own families on, and of course all along the way, the rioters and supporters of the movement in the press attacked the government for its regressive and unconstitutional policies in suppressing dissent and opposing popular participation in the government, and now not even leaving the people enough rice to feed themselves. The riots paralyzed Japan. It is estimated that some 10 million people participated across 33 cities, 104 towns, and 97 villages stretched across 36 of the 47 prefectures of Japan proper. Both the police and 50,000 army servicemen had to be pressed into service to bring the riots under control, with 20,000 arrests, of which over 8,100 were charged with a crime. 94% of those ended in conviction, usually resulting in a fine, but in some cases more serious penalties, up to life sentences. Still, while the state crackdown ended the riots by September, they didn't solve the core issue of the cost crisis. That would be solved by a combination of policies state bureaucrats derisively called ame to muchi, the sweets and the whip. Sweets in this case meant donations by the government and by large businesses to support relief efforts, as well as the government-backed sale of cheap rice to depress prices. The whip, meanwhile, meant bans on public meetings, as well as the censorship of the press in the name of public safety, in addition to heightened police presence around the country. But the issue of popular dissatisfaction with the government remained unresolved, and here is the most important legacy of the crisis. The prime minister at the time of the riots, Terauchi Masatake, was forced to resign in humiliation as the country fell apart under his leadership, but who was going to replace him? The Meiji Constitution, again to remind you, gave that power not to the Diet, but to the emperor and his counselors, the unelected Meiji oligarchs. By this time, many of the old leaders were dead. The architect of the Meiji Constitution, Ito Hirobumi, had himself been cut down by a Korean nationalist assassin in 1909. The senior-most survivor was Yamagata Aritomo, a staunch conservative and architect of the Imperial Japanese Army. But even the normally unflappable Yamagata was terrified by the riots and their potential to destabilize the country. After all, remember, this is 1918, the year after the Russian government was overthrown by those crazy communists. And this, perhaps, explains why Yamagata threw his weight behind a choice that I think in any other circumstance he would never have made. He decided to back not a different member of his inner circle, which was his usual approach, but a politician by the name of Hara Takashi. Hara is an interesting figure in the broader arc of Japanese history. He was born in 1856 into a minor samurai family from what was then Nanbu Domain, now a part of Iwate Prefecture in the north of Honshu. His family's domain was on the losing side of the Civil War of 1868, and so Hara had to make his own way in the world, moving to Tokyo as a young man to pursue any opportunity he could find. He would spend some time first as a journalist and then as a bureaucrat in the foreign ministry before leaving the bureaucracy to go back to journalism. In 1900, he made another career change, leaving journalism to join the newly formed political party known as the Rikken Seiyukai. That party, the Constitutional Friends of Government, was brand new in 1900, the brainchild of Ito Hirobumi, the same guy who'd written the Meiji Constitution. Ito hoped to construct his own pro-government party to contend for influence in the parliament, having seen the plans of his fellow oligarchs get stymied by the influence of liberal politicians in the Diet. He built the Seiyukai out of a combination of pro-government politicians and ex-bureaucrats who he convinced to go into politics. And as an aside, we've talked a little bit about elite bureaucrats during this period, but I really want to drill home an important point here. When we talk about bureaucrats in Japan, we are not talking about the same thing as bureaucrats in America. In the US, saying you work for the federal bureaucracy is not very glamorous. By contrast, in Japan, working for the national bureaucracy was the elite field. Japan's government bureaucracy was built by the Meiji oligarchs to implement their vision of the country through policy, and only the best and brightest were allowed through the door. Bureaucrats were culled by highly selective examinations from the most elite universities in the country, most notably Tokyo Imperial University, and they were given a large amount of largely unaccountable power by a government that was way more centralized than anything you would see in the US, which meant they had way more power than, say, your average federal bureaucrat does. As a result, during the imperial period in particular, Japan's bureaucrats tended to not be super fond of democracy. After all, how could common rabble know better than them, the educated elite? They were defined by an attitude of kanson minpi, revere the bureaucrat, despise the people. Hara Takashi, though, was not the typical ex-bureaucrat turned seiyukai politician. In particular, he was fond of a more populist image for himself. For example, he constantly referred to himself in public as a heimin, a commoner, despite the fact that his samurai status legally technically made him a shizoku, a sort of hereditary knighthood that didn't really offer any perks, but was kind of nice. And even as he rose politically, he refused any sort of honors or ennoblement that would separate him from the people. Particularly after Ito Hirobumi's assassination in 1909, Hara came to dominate the Seiyukai, which in turn became the main conservative party of pre-war Japanese politics. And so Hara, who was at least a conservative even as he was a politician, was the man Yamagata turned to in 1918 to take over as prime minister. And Hara said yes, the first politician to take the spot of prime minister in Japanese history. That said, it wasn't like Hara was being elected to this job. Remember, he was appointed under the rules of the Meiji Constitution, and at any rate, he wasn't exactly a popular champion, and never really worked to ingratiate himself with the masses, whose cause he supposedly held up as his own. Unlike the leaders of the liberal opposition parties, Hara, like most of his Seiyukai followers, had never been a part of older liberal movements like the Freedom and People's Rights movement. He'd been a government bureaucrat and had a bit of that kanson minpi in him. During his time as an elected representative in the Diet, he became famous for championing not liberal causes like the expansion of voting rights, but for his mastery of pork barrel politics, cutting deals with the military, for example, to support railroad expansion bills they wanted in exchange for their backing of infrastructure bills, which would win him support from his own voters. Hara even went out of his way to ingratiate himself personally to Yamagata, who Hara correctly perceived was the most powerful man in Japanese politics, and to whom he thus sucked up as hard as he could, which of course worked out for him, since that was how he got appointed prime minister in the first place. Hara was, to put it simply, not really a populist or a man of the people, or necessarily even particularly convicted about democracy, but a politician who saw a chance for personal advancement by taking advantage of a political moment. And hey, it did work for him, at least for a bit. After 3 years in office, he would be assassinated by a right-winger in Tokyo Station on his way to a party conference. Said right-winger blamed Hara for putting the interests of the Seiyukai above the broader needs of the nation as a whole. Still, despite his unfortunate exit from the office, Hara's time as prime minister set a new precedent, and going forward there was now an informal expectation that the prime minister be a politician from the largest political party, though that expectation was never written in law. Still, attempts to move away from it provoked pushback. For example, a 1924 attempt to select the non-politician, non-party ex-bureaucrat Kyoura Keigo as prime minister resulted in all of the political parties in the Diet coming together in a Protect the Constitution movement that shut down the entire government. Kyoura made it only 6 months in office before resigning because of his inability to get the Diet to consider even a single law. So what emerged in the aftermath of Hara's death was a sort of bizarre political Frankenstein, which today we call the Taisho democracy, a combination of political movements, constitutional structures, and party politics that produced, if not a functional democracy, at least something that resembled it. For a start, while the emperor and his advisors retained a lot of power on paper in the 1920s, practically speaking, they had a lot less influence than before. For one thing, the old leaders of the Meiji era were dying out. Yamagata Aritomo died in 1922, for example. They were replaced, of course. The emperor's privy council, his closest advisors, remained a potent political force. But the members of that council no longer enjoyed the incredible authority that had once belonged to guys like Ito Hirobumi or Yamagata Aritomo, who had essentially built the modern Japanese state, and who commanded a modicum of respect just because of that. For another, by the 20s, it was clear you couldn't just put whoever you wanted in the prime minister's seat and expect that people would just go along with it. The political parties just wouldn't stand for it, and without the parties, you couldn't get anything done in the Diet, which the Constitution of 1889 did specify was necessary to, pass laws and govern. And so it became conventional over the 20s to appoint as prime minister the head of the largest party in the Diet, though again, the law never mandated that, it was just practically speaking the only way to get anything done. Still, it's important not to overstate the nature of the political change that's occurring here. As Takayoshi Matsuo put it in his article on the Taisho democracy, the parties had three options as they accumulated more power. The first was to genuinely attempt to challenge the existing constitutional order and build a new structure that invested real power in the Diet, likely by means of amending the constitution. The second was to go with the status quo. The third was not to try and change the state structure, but to position themselves as its new managers rather than letting the emperor's advisors run the show. And this final option was the one the political parties largely chose. The Taisho democracy, in other words, was a period of gradual change. If you picture the Japanese government as this tangled web of influence and power, all that's really changing here is who's at the center of the web, now the parties instead of the oligarchs. And that control was always unstable. Between 1918 and 1931, Japan saw no less than 11 different prime ministers in office as coalitions constantly broke and reformed in the face of political crises. It's also worth noting the parties themselves had complicated relationships with the people they claimed to represent. The Seiyukai in particular remained very conservative throughout this period, and backed initiatives sponsored by conservative bureaucrats in the military to, for example, expand police powers to deal with subversion, and to suppress anarchist, communist, and socialist movements. Even the more liberal parties, whose names, again, I won't bother you with because they were constantly changing as the parties split, merged, and reformed, generally didn't oppose these measures, even as they pressed, for example, for the expansion of voting rights alongside them. In 1925, the Liberals actually won that one, with the right to vote being extended to every man over the age of 25. A similar bill to extend voting rights to women cleared the House of Representatives, but stalled out in the unelected House of Councilors. Overall, I think it's fair to say the political parties of the Taisho democracy were very much of the urban middle class. They mostly represented the wealthy, educated, and influential, who were their core constituency. The broader masses never really saw themselves as benefiting from the parties. And to be fair, the parties didn't really bother targeting the masses too much either. Still, it's important not to understate the Taisho democracy either. Mass protest and the political maneuvering of Hara Takashi and the Seiyukai had won important changes to how politics operated in Imperial Japan, and over the course of the 20s, broader liberalization did follow. At least in some areas. While the parties were happy to extend voting rights, they were also both very anti-leftist and happily accepted, for example, the 1925 Peace Preservation Law, which essentially criminalized left-wing organizing. Nor did either political party express much concern, for example, with Japan's empire, though both generally felt the empire as it existed by the 20s was about what Japan needed and that further expansion was unnecessary. Still, one can't help but wonder what would have happened if this system had been allowed to continue to develop. After a few decades, would Japan have transformed into a more mature democracy on its own? Could the Empire of Japan have liberalized under the influence of a growing democratic movement? Well, we can't really do more than wonder, because by the late 20s, two poles of opposition to this growing liberalism would emerge. First, in the bureaucracy, where elite bureaucrats were furious at what they saw as political meddling in their prerogatives, and then in the military, where officers began to fume that liberal politicians were undercutting Japan's strategic position with their weak-minded peacenik ways. Next week, we'll see how the opposition will crush the nascent Japanese democracy and fling Japan into not one but two unwinnable wars, but that's for next week. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shout-out tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, an anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Reese, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japanesia podcast, Jennifer Pianzio, James, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for the descent towards World War II.